Sorry about the interruption, but like I was saying, the northern communities were in flux. They hadn't really decided where black people were going to live, whether it was going to be segregated communities, marginalized communities, or whether they'd be allowed to live amongst everybody else. You basically had all three of those things going on at the beginning of the 20th century and throughout the 19th century, where blacks were at in the cities. It didn't really change completely until the influx of the immigrants at the turn of the century, when the other ethnic white groups started pouring into America. That further marginalized the areas where black people would be allowed to live at, let alone where they'd be allowed to work. There were many jobs that we were basically designated to do that basically was taken from us once the ethnic whites arrived from Europe. Barbering. They used to be an exclusively black occupation that was taken over. Dock work. That was a largely black occupation that was taken over. We used to work in factories in the Industrial Revolution. If those factories were located in areas where there was a high amount of black people, a lot of that went away when the immigrants came here. But I'm moving on. I'm on a tangent. I need to get back to housing. So, all right. We were given substandard housing in the north. We were given substandard housing in the south. You had more of an opportunity to perhaps live in housing that may be adequate in the north, but it wasn't that much of a chance. You still were likely being pushed to a place that was near railroad tracks or near swamps or any undesirable area that the white populace didn't want to be in. They would allow blacks to stay there. Or you could live in older housing that white people had abandoned and felt was substandard. That was your northern existence. It was the same in the south too, but the south is rural, so you may have had a bit more autonomy on what type of shack you could put together, but it still ended up being a shack. So things were so bad that by the Depression, you had black people living in slums where there still wasn't any there wasn't any indoor plumbing, it was outdoor plumbing. There still may not have been electricity. The heat may have been inadequate. And this is in the south and the north. In the south, it would be a rural shack like that. In the north, it would be a row home or an apartment tenement building like that. Um, what the government decided to do was to construct housing projects which had the latest electricity, plumbing, etc., and housed the blacks there. They built them on the sites of black communities that already were in existence. So they basically tore down the shacks and the tar paper houses and put projects over top of them. And instead of an impoverished area, they created vertical prisons. The idea was good at first. People appreciated it at first. They liked the fact they had access to bathrooms and heat and less vermin than they were dealing with previously. Unfortunately, they didn't own it. It was government owned. And while the initial occupants were happy and proud to be in a better surrounding than what they left, over time people felt they didn't have ownership in the project. And when that mentality took over, they decided to destroy the project from within, whether right or wrong. It's almost as if they felt that they were purposely placed in this poverty situation and they rebelled against it subconsciously by trying to tear it down. That seems to be what happened with a lot of project situations throughout America. It's as if black people subconsciously rebelled against being corralled into a tower of poverty. The poverty issues were never addressed. Poor white people after World War II were rewarded for fighting in World War II by having farmlands transformed into suburbs. Black people fought in World War II and we were directed right back to the slums and projects. Then, after World War II, they decided, hey, we need a national highway system. International, you can't drive across the ocean, that's funny. You need a national highway system to allow for rapid transport of weaponry and goods and services. And guess where they decided to run many of them through? The existing poor but cohesive black communities of the time. It was used as a tool of urban renewal. If we can't knock down their buildings and destroy their community or marginalize it that way, We'll run a highway through it. Then it just won't exist anymore. So that community that they were allowed to build and create, even if it was poor, by the river, across from the railroad tracks, by the swamp or whatever, that they may have been living in as a collective since the early 20th century, now you have to move. You may have worked, you may have retired there, just like any other citizen. You have to move. Why? Because your life isn't valued, your home ownership isn't valued, your citizenship isn't valued. You're just in the way. You were allowed to be there, now you're not allowed to be there. You got to go. You have no right. Eminent domain being used against persons who were already victimized by having to live there in the first place. So, this is the 60s by now. Integration is coming. When integration comes, it doesn't come all the way. It comes with firebombing and dead pets on porches and burning homes down for some of those upwardly mobile blacks who decided to move from these constrained areas to supposedly newly open suburban and integrated areas. It wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s where you had more substantial numbers able to move into these areas and not be physically assaulted. It still went on, but it was less. So those people were able to escape the slums and the poverty. The vast majority were not able to. Economically, mentally, meaning just the pressure of being a poor black person trying to make ends meet, dealing with the racism of police and teachers and employers. Is it sometimes just too much for people to try to be upwardly mobile when they're just dealing with survival? So that's why they stayed where they were. I mean, if you can't mentally wrap your mind around how to be strong enough to not just survive but push forward, then you're just going to try to do the best that you can. And that's how most people deal with things. So, poor white people, right, have the same flaws as poor black people. They might be short-sighted, they may drink too much, they may beat their wives, they may... A lot of pathologies that are linked with people in poverty apply equally to all races of people and a lot of different cultures of people. But in the United States, the poor white, who used to live in crowded housing too, who used to not be doing well also because economics drives everyone's situation, they were rewarded with suburbs. Suburbs were created for them. They didn't do well in school particularly. They weren't particularly good people. They were just regular poor people. But they were white-skinned. And the government said, we need to provide nicer environments for them so they can raise their children to live up to higher standards and improve America exponentially as positive contributing members of society. Blacks were seen as worthless, and it was seen as a mission to keep us where we already lived at. Well, they live in these shacks, they live in these areas, they're in these segregated areas. We're just going to build high-rise housing with modern amenities and keep them there. We don't want them moving anywhere. We're not going to create even a black suburbs or a black nice area for them. We're just going to build these high-rise homes and put them there, and hopefully they won't try to move out and come amongst us and ruin what we have going. I think that's pretty unfair. A suburb versus a project. What do you think? Don't you think the blacks who fought in World War II deserve to have consideration for landscaped land to allow them to live as middle class people as well? They didn't think so. The government didn't think so because all you got was Richard Allen projects and Carl Mackey projects and Edenwald and Bushwick in New York and the myriad projects all over the place, most of which had been knocked down because they seen that it was a failure. It was just basically a cauldron for evil and poverty and violence, and it was a failed experiment, but one of many that's been pushed on black people.